It started with a feeling, a nagging suspicion that I couldn't shake off. Eliza, my wife of over 10 years, had changed. It wasn't one big thing, but a collection of small, odd behaviors that started to pile up. She worked late more often, always with some excuse. Deadlines, meetings, projects that couldn't wait. I wasn't blind. I knew what late nights at the office could mean, and it wasn't always work. The more she stayed out, the more she seemed to distance herself when she came home. She'd be exhausted, yes, but it was a different kind of exhaustion, one that didn't just come from a hard day's work. Then there was her appearance. She started dressing differently. More revealing clothes, more makeup, even when she was just running errands. It was subtle, but I noticed it. One night, she came down in this tight red dress I'd never seen before, the kind she'd only wear for special occasions. When I asked about it, she brushed it off with a laugh, said it was just something she bought on a whim. But there was something in her eyes. It was like she was trying to impress someone else. That thought hit me harder than I wanted to admit. But the moment everything clicked was when I found the letter. It was a Tuesday. I had just come home from the gym and was sorting through the mail when I saw an envelope on the counter. It was addressed to her, written in a hand I didn't recognize. I opened it without thinking, and my stomach dropped when I read the message. Looking forward to seeing you again. You know where. Same time, same place. We both deserve this. No name, just a message that confirmed my worst fear. I stood there frozen. I wanted to confront her right then and there, demand answers. But something stopped me. I knew I couldn't act out of anger. I needed to gather the facts first. I couldn't let her turn this into a fight where she could deny everything. No, I had to expose the truth in a way that would leave her no room to escape. It wasn't just the betrayal that stung. It was the lies. The constant pretending, the way she made me feel like an idiot while she was out there with someone else. We'd built a life together, kids, a house, vacations, and now it was all a lie. I realized I had to be smart about this. I couldn't let her see that I knew. That's when I came up with a plan. The pulse. I'd make her question everything. I'd plant the smallest seeds of doubt, push her so subtly into a corner that she'd feel paranoid without knowing why. I wouldn't confront her directly. I'd let her crack under the weight of her own actions. It wasn't about revenge yet. It was about making her suffer, about giving her a taste of what it felt like to be caught in a lie so deep she couldn't find her way out. That was my goal, to break her from the inside, piece by piece, until the truth came tumbling out. And so, I began my plan. Quietly, carefully. I wasn't just going to catch her. I was going to make her destroy herself. The plan was simple. Create doubt, make her paranoid, but never say a word about what I knew. I started with casual conversation, dropping comments about cheating or broken relationships, always in a hypothetical sense. I read about a couple the other day. Guy finds out his wife's been cheating for months. That must be brutal, right? Or, isn't it strange how people stay in relationships after they betray each other? I didn't press her. I just let the words hang in the air. At first, Eliza would laugh it off, act like it was no big deal. But after a few weeks, I started noticing her reactions change. She became more defensive, more distant. If I mentioned something about cheating, she'd get fidgety, avoid eye contact. It wasn't obvious, but it was there. Something in the way she shifted when I spoke. She was starting to feel it, the subtle pressure, the sense that something wasn't right. That was the pulse. I wasn't accusing her yet. I was just making her doubt. Then I took it a step further. One morning, I left a folder on the kitchen counter titled, Meeting with Andrew, Notes. Andrew was a name I'd heard come up a few times, always in passing. I knew he was a colleague, but there was something about him that felt off. I left the folder right where she'd see it. I didn't say anything, but I knew she'd find it. The moment she saw it, she'd question everything. Was it a mistake? Or was it intentional, a subtle message from me? I didn't need to say anything. The doubt would do its work. Next, I started messing with our shared calendar. I'd change appointment times, shift social plans around, things that seemed like small mistakes. She'd ask me about them, confused. I'd play dumb, feign innocence. But the changes were small enough to make her question her own memory. Was she forgetting things? Or was someone else behind it? The anonymous texts came next. I bought a burner phone and started sending cryptic messages. "I know what you're doing," or "I see where you've been." They weren't threats, but they made her think. Who was sending these? What did they know? Every time her phone buzzed, I could see the tension in her eyes. She'd be scared to look, but I knew she had to. I also started planting subtle clues on her social media. I posted old pictures from trips we'd taken, memories only she would recognize. They weren't obvious, but the implication was there. Someone close to her knew what she was doing. It wasn't about exposure, it was about making her feel like she was being watched, making her question who could be behind it. I never confronted her. Not yet. But the weight of all these little things, all this doubt and confusion, began to build. The anxiety was eating away at her. And I knew, deep down, it was only a matter of time before she cracked. By now, Eliza was on edge. I could see it in the way she checked her phone, the way she double-checked plans. Every little shift in our routine seemed to rattle her. She was starting to doubt everything, and that was exactly what I wanted. But I couldn't stop there. I needed to take it further, tighten the grip just a little more. The web was about creating a network of little manipulations, turning her world upside down without her even realizing it. One evening, I casually mentioned I'd run into someone she knew at the grocery store. Andrew, of course. I said I had seen him with some woman, and how he looked a little too cozy with her for just a colleague. It wasn't a direct accusation, but I could see the tension rise in her. Her eyes flickered, and she tried to brush it off, but I knew she was rattled. The next step was using technology, location-based apps, shared calendars, little things I could alter to mess with her mind. One night, I changed the location of a work meeting on our shared calendar. Instead of the usual office location, I made it somewhere more intimate, a place she and Andrew might frequent. It wasn't blatant, but when she saw it, her face went pale. She called me right away, asking if I knew about the change. I told her I hadn't touched it. "Must be a glitch," I said, as casually as I could. But I could see she was already second-guessing everything. Was it a glitch, or was it me? I upped the ante with the texts. The burner phone came in handy. This time, I didn't just stick to the cryptic lines. I added new ones, more pointed. "I know what's going on. You think no one sees." She was getting jumpy now, constantly checking her phone, always wondering who was sending these, what they knew. Every little slip-up made her more paranoid. But the most effective part of the web wasn't the physical signs or the digital manipulations. It was the social game. I started subtly reaching out to people she knew, friends of hers who might not even be that close anymore. I made casual comments in front of mutual acquaintances, things like, "It's crazy how things change, huh? People always think no one knows." It was indirect, but it planted the idea that maybe her whole social circle was starting to figure things out. I wasn't accusing her, but I was making her feel like the walls were closing in. I could see it in her eyes. There was no longer any certainty in her face when she looked at me. She was guessing. Was I in on it? Was I playing some long con to expose her? Every time she laughed it off, I saw the cracks in her smile. The doubt was eating at her, and she was too afraid to confront it. She didn't know who to trust, and that's exactly where I wanted her. By the time I was done, she didn't know what was real anymore. She couldn't be sure of anything. I'd made sure of that, and it was only a matter of time before she'd crack under the weight of her own paranoia. The anxiety was growing inside Eliza. I could see it in the way she moved, more erratic, more cautious. She jumped at every little noise, checked over her shoulder whenever we were out in public. The tension between us had become palpable, but she still hadn't said a word. I wasn't ready for her confession yet, not until I made her question herself completely. The labyrinth was designed to push her to the edge, to twist her mind until she couldn't tell up from down. I started sending more cryptic messages. At first, they were harmless, just vague warnings. But now, I ramped up the game. One night, I sent a text from the burner phone that simply read, "You'll regret this." No explanation. No context. Just that one chilling line. She stared at it for a long time, but I knew she couldn't make sense of it. She had no idea who it was from or why it was sent. It didn't matter. It was enough to make her feel watched, like someone was lurking just out of sight, waiting for her to slip. I kept playing this game, sending random, disjointed messages. Things like, "You won't get away with it," or "It's only a matter of time." They weren't specific, but they were designed to be impossible to ignore. She was starting to question who was behind them. Was it Andrew? Was it someone else who knew about the affair? Or was it just me, toying with her? Each time, I could see the panic rising in her. Then came the phone call. I made sure it was an unknown number. She answered, and when she did, all she heard was a breath on the other end before the line went dead. Nothing else. Just the silence. But I knew she was rattled. When I got home that night, she was on edge, nervously pacing the living room. She asked me if I'd been calling her, but I feigned confusion. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, and I could see the relief flood her face as she convinced herself it wasn't me. It wasn't just the messages and the calls. I was closing in on her, pushing her deeper into the maze. Every time I could see she was close to cracking, I backed off, giving her just enough space to doubt herself. It was all psychological manipulation, making her wonder if she was imagining things or if the pressure was real. The labyrinth wasn't just about sending messages or messing with her routine. It was about isolating her, making her feel like she had nowhere to turn. I started mentioning things in passing, things that would plant more doubt. "Have you ever noticed how people always seem to act a little different when they've done something wrong?" I'd ask, just casually, as if I were thinking out loud. Or, sometimes, "I wonder how people can live with themselves when they're hiding something." I never mentioned her affair directly, but I could see the shift in her eyes each time I spoke. She couldn't tell if I knew, or if she was simply unraveling. By now, she couldn't trust her own instincts. Her mind was trapped in a constant cycle of suspicion and self-doubt, and I had orchestrated every piece. The maze was closing in, and she had no idea where the walls were, only that she was running out of room. And I wasn't done yet. The time had come. After weeks of manipulating her, twisting her mind, it was finally time to let Eliza face the truth. Not the truth of the affair. That part was already clear to me, but the truth of who she had become. The mirror was my final act, a moment where she had no choice but to confront everything. I invited her to dinner at the restaurant where we'd celebrated our first anniversary. I recreated everything, the same table, the same wine. I wanted it to feel familiar, comfortable, a place where she could drop her guard. She didn't suspect anything. I started the conversation slowly. "Do you ever think about second chances?" I asked casually. She looked at me, confused. "Like, if you messed up, would you want someone to forgive you?" She didn't seem to catch on. "Of course," she said. "Everyone makes mistakes. We're human." I pushed it further. "But what if you were the one who did the betraying? What if you hurt someone you loved?" She laughed, a little too nervously, and replied, "I don't think I'd ever do that." I could see the shift in her face, the way she tried to hold on to her composure, but her defenses were starting to crack. I went deeper. "Do you think people can truly forgive someone who's lied for months? Someone who's kept something huge hidden?" She hesitated, her smile faltering, but she quickly recovered, avoiding my gaze. "I don't know," she muttered, her voice weaker now. I knew I was getting to her. What if it was something big? Something that destroyed trust? Ruined everything? The question hit its mark. Her face tightened, and for the first time, she stopped hiding. The guilt was all over her. The silence between us thickened. She started fidgeting with her napkin, glancing at her phone, trying to avoid my eyes. But the pressure was too much. Finally, she cracked. "Victor, I need to tell you something. It was over." She confessed to everything, the affair with Andrew, the lies, the betrayal. I didn't need to shout or accuse her. She had destroyed herself by just answering my questions. This wasn't a moment of honesty, it was the culmination of everything I had orchestrated to make her break. As she spoke, I felt nothing. No relief, no satisfaction, just emptiness. This was the person she had chosen to become, and now she had to live with it. She thought confessing would be the start of redemption, but in reality, it was the point of no return. The confession was just the beginning. What came next was far worse than she could ever imagine. After Eliza confessed, I sat there, numb. The woman I had married, the woman I thought I knew, wasn't sitting across from me anymore. She was just someone who had shattered everything. She told me everything, about Andrew, how it started harmlessly, and how it spiraled out of control. But I didn't care about the details or her excuses. The damage was done, and no amount of words could fix it. I stayed silent, letting her talk, but inside, I felt nothing. She wasn't looking for forgiveness. She was just hoping for relief from the guilt. But I wasn't going to give her that. After she finished, I simply stared at her, cold. You ruined everything, I said flatly. I didn't need to destroy you. You did that all on your own. Eliza begged for another chance. She promised to end things with Andrew, to fix everything. But I couldn't care less. The trust was gone, and no apology would change that. I didn't react in anger, but I knew the real work was about to begin. Over the next few days, I set my plan in motion. First, I went after Andrew. I knew enough about his business to cause serious damage. Using my contacts, I started spreading rumors about him. Unethical deals, shady practices. The whispers grew louder, and soon, he was being avoided by everyone in his circle. Within a week, his business and reputation were in freefall. He had no idea what hit him. But I didn't stop there. I turned my attention to Eliza. At work, I quietly planted rumors about her. Small things at first, questions about her reliability, subtle doubts about her character. Nothing direct, but enough to sow discord. Slowly, colleagues began to distance themselves from her. Invitations to meetings were rescinded. She started to feel the weight of her isolation. Her social life started to crumble too. Friends, the ones she thought would support her, began to pull away. Some drifted quietly, others openly questioned her. People didn't know exactly what was wrong, but they could feel it. Eliza became a pariah without even realizing why. She came to me a week later, desperate, pleading for forgiveness. She was sorry, she said. She couldn't undo what she'd done, but she wanted to try. But I just looked at her coldly, repeating the same words I'd said before. You ruined everything. She still didn't get it. She thought confessing would change things, that it would somehow fix the mess she made. But it was too late. Her career, her friendships, her reputation, it was all slipping away. And all the while, she had no idea that I was the one pulling the strings. She had no idea I was the one orchestrating her downfall. She had already destroyed herself, and I didn't need to do anything else. Weeks went by, and Eliza continued to fall apart. She still didn't understand what was happening, why everything in her life seemed to be crashing down. She kept trying to fix things, but every attempt only seemed to make it worse. I watched it all unfold, detached, while her life unraveled around her. She wasn't the woman I had married, and I was no longer the man she thought I was. At work, things grew more difficult. The rumors I'd planted began to take root. Her colleagues pulled away, her boss grew increasingly critical, and even the smallest mistakes became bigger issues. She couldn't shake the feeling that people were watching her, judging her, and she was right. She had become a liability, and she was starting to realize it. One evening, she came home looking exhausted, defeated. I don't understand what's happening, she said, her voice trembling. Everything's falling apart, and I don't know why. I could see the frustration in her eyes, but I didn't feel sorry for her. I just watched her, silent, as she vented about her day. Her boss had given her a warning about missed deadlines and disorganization. Nothing major, but I could tell it stung. She had always prided herself on her competence, and now it was slipping away. Instead of offering sympathy or anger, I stayed calm. I knew this wasn't about her work, it was the slow collapse of her entire life, and I didn't need to get involved. She was the one who had caused all of it. She tried to reach out to friends, hoping for support, but even they started to turn on her. Some were still polite, but the invitations stopped, the texts got shorter. Her social circle shrank, and she had no idea why. It wasn't obvious, but I saw the changes, the subtle distancing. Eliza was starting to feel the sting of isolation, but she couldn't connect the dots. One night, she looked at me, her face etched with desperation. "Do you still love me, Victor?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question hit me harder than I expected, but I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence hang in the air, feeling the weight of it. Finally, she spoke again. "I can't do this alone, Victor. Please." I didn't answer. I didn't know what to say anymore. She was no longer the woman I loved. The woman who had betrayed me was all that was left. I just walked away, leaving her to deal with the mess she'd made of her life. She still didn't understand what had happened. She didn't realize that every bit of her downfall, every moment of panic, was because of me. But I didn't need to expose her. I didn't need to make a scene. She was already destroying herself. As weeks passed, Eliza's life fell apart, but she couldn't see the strings I was pulling. Her career was tanking, her social life had disintegrated, and her once close-knit friendships were unraveling. People were distancing themselves, and she couldn't understand why. She blamed the universe, bad luck, or some vague misfortune, but she didn't realize how much of it was deliberate. Every step of her decline had been carefully orchestrated. By now, I had no need to confront her directly. She was already suffocating under the weight of her own choices. I knew what was coming. She just had no idea how far gone she truly was. One evening, after a particularly stressful day, she sat on the couch, staring blankly at a magazine she wasn't reading. I watched her for a moment, noting the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers tapped nervously on the pages. It was clear she was just trying to fill the silence, but the silence wasn't her enemy. It was the growing realization that everything was falling apart. I walked in and leaned casually against the doorframe, breaking the silence. "Quiet tonight," I remarked. She barely glanced up. "Just tired," she muttered, her voice hollow. "Everything feels like it's slipping." I didn't respond. I just stood there, watching, letting her feel the weight of her isolation. Eventually, I stepped closer, speaking softly. "You ever wonder why everyone's pulling away from you? Colleagues, friends, people you thought would always be there." She didn't look up, but I could see her face tighten. She knew where this was going. "Doesn't it make you think?" "All of it, unraveling. Your career, your friends, your life. You thought you had it all under control, didn't you?" Her eyes shifted, avoiding mine. I could see the panic rising behind her mask of indifference. "You never saw this coming, did you? Thought you could have it all. Juggle your career, your affair, your perfect little life," I went on, stepping closer still. "But it's all falling apart now." She set the magazine down slowly, her hands trembling. She met my gaze for the first time, and I saw a flicker of fear. She couldn't say it, but she knew. She knew I was right. "Who's going to believe you now, Eliza? Who's going to buy that story once it all comes out?" I asked, my voice quiet but insistent. Her eyes flickered, but she didn't respond. She couldn't. "It's too late for apologies," I continued. "Too late to fix what you've broken." She stood up slowly, her face drained of color. "I didn't want any of this," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I never meant for it to go this far." But her apology sounded hollow now, like a script she had repeated too many times. She thought she could undo it all with words, but she couldn't. She had crossed a line, and there was no coming back. "You already lost everything," I said calmly. "And it's not because of me. It's because of what you did." She didn't answer, and in that moment, I knew it didn't matter if she ever truly understood. The damage had been done. She had already destroyed herself. I didn't need to expose her. She was already living her punishment, and she didn't even realize it. The days after our last conversation were heavy with silence. Eliza was unraveling, but she didn't understand that the damage was already done. Her desperate attempts to fix things only made it worse. Texts, calls, little gestures. None of them reached me. It was over, but she couldn't see that. One morning, I found a note on the kitchen counter. It was from her. "Let's talk, please." But it wasn't an invitation to resolve anything. It was just more of the same, an attempt to pretend things were normal. I didn't bother to reply. She kept trying though. She'd make small talk when I came home, like everything was fine. But I could see the cracks, the way she couldn't meet my gaze, the nervousness in her movements. It was obvious. The guilt was hanging over her like a dark cloud, and it was suffocating her. One evening, I came home after a long day to find her sitting at the dining table, her face pale and drawn. She didn't speak when I walked in, just stared at the table, her hands clenched in her lap. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I let it linger. Eventually, she looked up at me. "I've been thinking about everything," she started, her voice shaky. "I know I messed up." It wasn't the first time she'd said those words, but this time, it felt even emptier. She didn't even know what she was truly apologizing for. She didn't understand the weight of the betrayal, the layers of lies she'd built up. "Do you really want to talk about it?" I asked, my voice flat. "Because you don't. You just want me to tell you it's okay, but it's not." She flinched but didn't argue. She knew it was true. The truth had already set in, and she couldn't deny it anymore. She wasn't looking for a solution. She was just trying to salvage what little she could. "I'm sorry, Victor," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know I betrayed you. I can't fix it, but I want to try. Please, I don't want to lose you." I stood still, staring at her. Her words were hollow. "You already lost me," I said, my voice cold and final. She went silent, the weight of it hitting her all at once. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't soften. I didn't need to. I don't know what to do anymore," she said, her voice breaking. "What do you want me to say? How can I fix this?" I gave her a long, hard look. "There's nothing left to fix," I replied. "You did this. You ruined everything. Not me." Her face crumpled as if the reality of my words hit her in that moment. She didn't speak again. I didn't need to elaborate. There was nothing more to say. I turned and walked away, leaving her there, frozen in that spot. She was broken, but she'd broken herself. She didn't understand that yet, but I didn't need to explain it to her. The damage was already done, and she was already paying the price. Days passed in a blur, and Eliza's attempts to patch things up became more frantic, more desperate. She'd reach out with messages that seemed genuine at first, but the desperation behind them was transparent. Her latest move? Sending me a link to a marriage counseling service. A subtle hint, as if paying a professional to talk about our problems could undo the damage she'd caused. But I wasn't fooled. It wasn't about saving us, it was about saving her own skin. I couldn't take it anymore. She was spinning her wheels, pretending like there was some magic fix that would restore everything. But what she didn't realize was that everything was already destroyed, and no amount of therapy or fake smiles would change that. One afternoon, she came home early from work, her face flushed with the effort of holding it all together. She wanted to confront me again, to plead, but I wasn't in the mood for her games. I knew she could feel the walls closing in on her. Her job was a mess, her reputation ruined, and her friends were slowly drifting away. She came into the living room, her eyes wide with the same guilt I had seen in her for weeks now. "Victor, we need to talk. We can still fix this. I've been thinking a lot, and..." I cut her off. "No. We're done talking. We've been talking in circles for weeks. Nothing's going to change." She blinked, surprised, as if she couldn't understand why I was being so cold. "I don't know what you want me to do. I'm trying. I'm really trying." "No, Eliza," I said, my voice steady. "You're not trying. You're panicking. And it's pathetic." Her face twisted, and for a second, I saw a flicker of anger, real anger, not the fake frustration she'd been showing. "So what? This is it? You're just going to walk away?" I didn't flinch. "You don't get it, do you? You've already walked away. You just haven't realized it yet." She stood there, stunned, her hands gripping the edge of the couch, as if trying to steady herself. I could see the tears welling up in her eyes, but I felt nothing. Her breakdowns didn't affect me anymore. "The worst part is," I continued, my tone calmer now, "you've ruined everything, and you don't even know how you did it. You think I'm the one who's walked away. But I'm not the one who betrayed you." She opened her mouth to argue, but I saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes. She knew. She knew exactly who had ruined everything. "I don't want your pity," I said flatly. "I don't need your apologies. They mean nothing to me now." She took a step back, her body shaking. She finally understood. It wasn't just about the affair. It was about everything. The lies, the betrayal, the years she'd spent pretending I was just an afterthought. I had been patient, too patient, and now I wasn't going to waste any more time. "Goodbye, Eliza," I said, turning toward the door. She didn't stop me. She couldn't. I had already left her long before that moment. As I walked out, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. The worst of it was over. She had no more tricks up her sleeve. She was left with the shattered reflection of everything she had ruined. And I was done. After I left, I thought Eliza might come to terms with it, but instead, she started to spiral in ways I hadn't anticipated. I expected anger, maybe some final desperate act to try and fix things, but it wasn't like that. It was quieter, more insidious, the slow unraveling of a life she had once controlled so perfectly. At first, she kept up the charade. She still went to work, still attended the social events she always had, smiling and pretending nothing had changed. But it didn't take long before the cracks started to show. People noticed. Colleagues who had once adored her now kept their distance. Rumors floated through the office. I didn't need to hear the whispers to know what was being said. She could no longer hide behind her polished image. What struck me the most was the emptiness in her. She wasn't the same confident woman I'd once known. She was fading, disappearing into the consequences of her choices. And every time she tried to pretend she was fine, it only made things worse. One night, I came home late to find her pacing in the living room, papers scattered across the floor. Her eyes were wide, frantic. "Victor, please. You have to fix this," she begged. "Everything's falling apart. I don't know what to do anymore." I stood still, not sure whether to feel pity or frustration. I didn't say anything at first. Instead, I just stared at her. She looked broken. But I wasn't going to pretend. She'd made her bed. "This is your mess, Eliza," I said finally, my voice flat. "Not mine. You did this. You can't undo it now." Her face twisted, but there was no fire in her anymore. Just fear. She wasn't the woman who'd been so sure of herself, who'd played the game so well. Now, she was a woman watching her entire world crumble, unsure of how to stop it. "I never meant for it to go this far," she whispered, but I saw through it. It didn't matter what she meant. What mattered was what she'd done. I shook my head. "You can't fix this. The damage is done. It's not about us. It's about what you've done to yourself." She didn't argue, just stood there, looking defeated. Her career was slipping away, her friends were fading, and the woman who had once been the center of attention was now an outcast. The rumors about her ethics at work were starting to gain traction. Her phone calls and emails were being ignored. She could feel it. People were already writing her off. I watched her, but I didn't feel anything. Not anger, not sympathy. Just a quiet sense of finality. She had built her life on lies, and now they were crumbling piece by piece. The worst part wasn't the affair being exposed. It was watching her slowly realize that no amount of apologies or therapy would fix the real problem. The real problem was her. And there was nothing she could do to put the pieces back together. Days passed, and I could almost feel Eliza's desperation in the air around her. I didn't see her much, but I didn't need to. She was unraveling in ways I had only imagined. The job she'd worked so hard for was slipping from her grasp. People who had once been her closest friends now avoided her like the plague. The facade was crumbling, and it wasn't pretty. But the most unsettling part was that she refused to accept it. She kept holding on to the idea that I could somehow make it all better. She thought if she showed up just one more time, if she said the right words, maybe I'd change my mind. I hadn't given her any reason to think that, but she was desperate. Desperate enough to believe a little more effort might save everything. One evening, she appeared at my door, carrying a small bottle of wine. It was her favorite, one she used to bring on special occasions, the kind of gesture that used to feel sweet. But now, it felt hollow, like she was trying to buy back a piece of the life we once shared. She handed it to me, along with a note. The words were simple. "I'm sorry. I miss you. Let's start over." I didn't let her in. I didn't open the door fully. Instead, I stood there, barely acknowledging her presence. Eliza, stop, I said, my tone as cold as the night air between us. This isn't going to work. You can't undo what you've done. Her eyes flickered with pain, but there was no fire left in her. She wasn't angry, she was just empty. I know I messed up, she said quietly. I don't know how to fix it, but I need you, Victor. I don't know who I am without you. I glanced at her for a moment, that familiar sorrow creeping in, but it wasn't enough to change anything. You never needed me, Eliza, I replied. You needed someone who wouldn't see through your lies. Someone who wouldn't question everything you did. And now, here we are. Her fingers tightened around the wine bottle, her knuckles white. She was shaking now, but it wasn't from cold, it was from the weight of everything she had lost. I can't fix this, no matter how many times you come here with gifts or apologies, I continued. You've already broken everything. And you did it to yourself. She opened her mouth to say something, but there was nothing left. No excuse she could make that would change the reality of what had happened. I'm sorry, she muttered, more to herself than to me, her voice cracking. I really am. But even that felt hollow. I could see it in her eyes. She was still trying to grasp at something that was already gone. She wasn't apologizing for the affair. She wasn't apologizing for betraying me. She was apologizing because her world was falling apart, and I was the last thing left she could try to fix it with. She took a deep breath, but the words never came. She didn't beg. She didn't try to persuade me. She just turned and walked away, the weight of her failure trailing behind her. I stood in the doorway, watching her fade into the night, and felt nothing but relief. It was over at last. Eliza's visits grew less frequent after our last encounter. She stopped showing up with apologies or gifts, her attempts to reconcile fading away. I could sense the shift in her though. What was once hope slowly turned into resignation. She wasn't trying to fix things anymore. She was just trying to survive the wreckage of her own making. Then came the phone call. It was from an unfamiliar number, and when I answered, a man's voice came through the line, calm but authoritative. Mr. Hayes, he asked. This is Colin's lawyer. My heart skipped a beat. I'd been waiting for this, for Colin to finally pay the price for his betrayal. We've got some issues with Mr. Hull, the lawyer continued. It appears he's gotten himself into some legal trouble. We're looking into a few things, and his activities may have attracted some unwanted attention. I didn't need him to elaborate. I knew exactly what he meant. Colin had lived in a bubble of confidence, thinking his wealth and connections would shield him. But I'd made sure to weaken that shield. Slowly, methodically. I had planted the seeds of doubt, created rumors, and now it was all coming to a head. Colin was about to lose everything. I didn't rush to reply. I let the silence hang in the air before speaking. I understand, I said, my voice neutral. Let me know if I can be of assistance. I hung up the phone, and for a brief moment, I felt a quiet satisfaction. The plan was unfolding just as I'd imagined. Colin's empire was crumbling, his reputation being shredded. Soon, he'd be nothing more than a cautionary tale. But that was just the beginning. I had already started to work on Eliza. It had begun subtly, just little things, a misdirected email, a small comment about her performance at work. Nothing overt, just whispers in the right ears. The people who had once been her closest allies were beginning to pull away, and she didn't even realize it was happening. At first, it seemed insignificant, but over time, the damage began to compound. She started losing ground at work, her professional relationships faltering, colleagues becoming distant. The more she tried to salvage her reputation, the worse it got. Her career, just like her personal life, was falling apart. I could hear it in her voice, the anxiety creeping in during our brief exchanges. The cracks were becoming obvious. She didn't need me to tell her. It was already happening. She was losing control, losing everything she'd taken for granted. But what gave me the most satisfaction wasn't watching her fail in public. It was seeing her sink into self-doubt, questioning every move, unsure of who she could trust. She was trapped in a prison of her own making, and I hadn't needed to do anything more than let her destroy herself. As for Colin, his legal troubles would only get worse. His reputation would be destroyed, and his wealth would slip away, piece by piece. I didn't need to get my hands dirty. All I had to do was wait. They were both falling apart, and I was content to let them unravel. One evening, I was sitting at home, trying to focus on work, when I heard a knock at the door. It was quiet, almost hesitant. I already knew who it was before I even opened it. Eliza. When I opened the door, she stood there, pale, eyes red, hair a mess. She didn't have any gifts this time. No flowers. No wine. Just a look of complete despair. "I don't know what's happening," she said, her voice trembling. "I can't keep going like this." I didn't speak at first. I just stood there, watching her. She looked like someone who had lost everything. The woman who used to try so hard to hold things together was now a shell of that person, standing in front of me, broken. "You're losing everything, Eliza," I said finally, keeping my tone even. "Your job, your friends, your life. Don't you see it?" She swallowed hard, taking a step forward, as if hoping I'd pull her inside. "I know," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "I didn't think it would get this bad. I didn't think I'd lose everything. Please, Victor. I need you to fix this." I shook my head slowly, feeling nothing but exhaustion. "It's too late for that." Her face fell. For a brief moment, I saw a flicker of the woman I once loved, but it was buried under guilt and regret that I couldn't feel sorry for her anymore. I couldn't feel anything except the weight of her choices. "I didn't want this," she said, voice cracking. "I didn't want to hurt you. I was just stupid." Her words didn't matter anymore. They never really had. Not after everything. "Maybe," I said flatly, "but it doesn't change what you did, or how you've ruined everything. Not just for me, but for yourself too." Her hands trembled as she reached into her bag, and I braced myself, expecting another apology, another gesture of regret. But instead, she pulled out her phone, holding it out toward me with a shaky hand. "Colin," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "He's gone. Everything's falling apart. I don't know what to do." The name hit me like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean gone?" "He's being investigated," she said, her voice breaking. "His business, his finances, everything. And I don't know what to do anymore." Hearing her finally acknowledge that Colin's world was crumbling was almost satisfying. The empire he built on lies was coming down, just as I'd orchestrated. "You don't need to fix anything," I said coldly. "You never needed to fix anything. You needed to be honest. But you didn't. And now it's too late." She stared at me, her face wet with tears, but all I felt was emptiness. The woman who had torn my world apart was now standing there, lost and broken, with nothing left to hold on to. "Victor," she whispered, her voice soft, desperate. "Please, just tell me what to do." I looked at her for a long moment, feeling nothing but the weight of everything she had destroyed. "You already know what to do," I replied. "You need to accept that it's over." Without another word, I closed the door. A week passed. Maybe two. The days blurred together, and the house felt quieter than ever. I was just going through the motions, work, errands, the usual, but none of it really felt real anymore. The calm before the storm had stretched on longer than expected. Then the fallout began, slow and steady, like a wave that crashes without warning. One afternoon, I got an email from one of Eliza's former colleagues. The subject line, "You might want to see this." It was a series of screenshots from a work chat. Whispers had started. People were talking about her behavior, how she'd been showing up late, missing meetings, and acting distant. The more I read, the clearer it became. Her work life was falling apart just like everything else. But it wasn't just at work. Her friends were starting to pull away too. Invitations stopped. Calls stopped. The people who had once adored her, the ones who saw her as the queen of the social scene, were distancing themselves. They'd all seen the cracks. Then I checked her social media, another thing I hadn't wanted to do, but couldn't help myself. Her posts were still up. Vacations, moments from our life together, pictures from the good times. But it all felt empty now. A ghost of what used to be. What hit hardest were the comments. Her closest friends had started to post cryptic things. "I always knew you were better than this. He deserved more." Her world was unraveling, and she didn't even know how to stop it. In the midst of all this, I ran into her one last time at a small gathering, a forced attempt at closure. She looked nothing like the woman I once knew. The confident, charming person was gone. All that remained was someone broken, struggling to hold it together. When she saw me, she didn't speak. Her gaze dropped, like she couldn't face me anymore. There was no apology this time, no plea for forgiveness. Just avoidance, like she was trying to pretend none of it ever happened. I didn't feel sorry for her. She had made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. There were no second chances left for her, no way to undo the damage she had done, not just to me but to herself. I stayed long enough to watch her try to blend into the crowd, her fragile mask barely holding. The world she'd built was collapsing. It was too late to fix anything. She was no longer in control. As I walked away from that gathering, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The anger, the pain, it had all faded. There was no more need for revenge, no need to keep fighting. She was destroying herself, and I didn't have to lift a finger to make it happen. The final realization hit me as I stepped out into the quiet night. I had already let go. No more anger, no more grief. Just emptiness.